of Chelmno, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, Majdanek, Auschwitz. And the Nazis burned the Hebrew Bible 76 years ago on Kristallnacht, on November 9th and 10th, 1938. Not just one copy, Professor Confino tells us, but thousands, not in one place, but in hundreds of communities, and not only in the metropolises of Berlin, of Vienna, Dresden, Stuttgart, and Cologne, but also in small communities, such as Sulzburg, a Protestant village in Baden with 1,000 inhabitants. 120 of them were Jewish. So look at item 2 on your handout. It was a carnival of destruction, fueled by anger, hatred, and rage. The spectacle invited participation. The burning of the Torah expressed an unspoken language that Confino, the historian, wants us to grapple with. Unspoken, but expressed in hateful acts that Nazi Germany directed against the Jews. Destroying the German humanist legacy, the Nazis aimed for a new cultural origin in a pagan German past. By attacking the Jews and Judaism, Kristallnacht was the beginning of the Nazi effort to redefine Germany and forge a new Aryan identity. Not only individual Jews and Jewish families like the Baumgartens and the Rosenbergs were to be attacked, but Judaism. Judaism that is fundamental to Western culture and to Christianity. What and how we acted as we responded would be paradigmatic. What we Jews did would also be a message about Judaism, about what my friend Edward Alexander has called the Jewish idea. How do the actions and words of individual Jews then help us understand how we, who come after them and benefit from their suffering and struggle, might, through commemoration, devise a set of responses, a structure of relations and meanings that will stand against the hatred of the Jewish other so profoundly embedded in the racism of Aryan culture? How would what we did then help us to resist? That night of Kristallnacht, my grandfather, Zvi Hirsch Baumgarten, a veteran of the Austrian army, he had fought against the Russians in World War I, was arrested and taken to a camp along with other Jewish men whom the Nazi thugs rounded up on the streets. How did they know he was Jewish? He was modern, Austrian, Viennese. He didn't have a beard, no fringes dangling. What made him a Jew in their eyes? To the Nazis, this older Jew was the misfortune, that was, they called it, the Unglück of Germany. He was lucky. That day, that very day, an American visa had arrived for him that included Grandma Clara, his wife, my Aunt Ina, whose son is here among us, my Aunt Ina. The visa was sent by my Uncle Marcus, who was living and working in New York City. It was the best Uncle Marcus could do, given the American financial requirements for refugee families. My parents, my sister and I, were already in the New World, but Dad's younger brother Eli would now have to fend for himself. With the visa for entry to the United States in her hand, my Aunt Ina headed to the police station, demanding that they release her father. She said to me, "I knew how to talk, I knew how to yell." She got her father out. The family luck was holding, for that morning, a co-worker among Uncle Eli's, a fellow union members, gave him some money and told him, "Don't go home." Eli went underground, hiding out, till he too could get to Holland and arrive in Panama, where for years he lived with us. My father always said it was luck. If we hadn't been lucky, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Last year, Shaul Bassi discussed three types of memory: individual memory, communicative memory, cultural memory. I follow in his footsteps to ask what we do when we remember Kristallnacht. As you can see, for me, it's personal. I've told you a bit about my father's decision to leave Vienna. It's a personal story. But when does the private memory of one family become part of a larger public experience? Next to the grand tragic narratives of Primo Levi or Elie Wiesel, is Max Baumgarten's story marginal? Or does it, like theirs, edge into the destinies of many Jews during the war? Consider then this other story from my mother's side of the family, and how those Jews were stereotyped, profiled we might say today, and then marked to be disposed of. My maternal uncle, Emanuel Rosenberg, was seized by the Nazis in 1938 after Anschluss. He was a lawyer, and during the 6 months of his imprisonment in Dachau, forced to look into the sun, and then at night into the headlights of a car. He was let out early in 1939. At that time, Nazi policy toward the Jews was directed to get the Jews to leave and leave their possessions behind. Or perhaps he was released according to family lore, because his wife, Tante Fanka, managed to gain an interview with Adolf Eichmann and negotiated her husband's release. Later, of course, nothing less than murdering the Jews would do. My uncle Emanuel and Aunt Fanka managed to get visas and moved to Israel with their infant son George, Yisrael, my first cousin, where they lived for almost 10 years, and then the family resettled in Montreal. In Vienna, Uncle Emanuel had practiced law. In Canada, he became a mattress manufacturer. But he was a learned man. He always studied Torah. And I remember when we met, and I was a first-year student in college studying the Greeks, the Iliad. He said, "You're studying the Iliad?" And he began to recite it in Greek. I hope some of you are studying Greek today. In the summer of 1950, my mother Bertha died suddenly of a stroke, 2 scant years after we'd made it to the United States from Panama. I was 12. I said Kaddish for her that year of mourning and every year since at her yahrzeit. Uncle Emanuel, her brother, came to New York on a condolence visit. On the subway, as Uncle Emanuel and I were going downtown, he told me he had survived the cruel persuasion of Dachau by reciting Psalms. Speaking the words of the Psalms of the Hebrew Bible, he had access to a different reality than the one the Nazis were forcing him into. My teacher at the Jewish Theological Seminary, David Weiss Halivni, has written of another way in which traditional Jewish learning continued during the years of the Holocaust and continued to matter for imprisoned Jewish slave laborers. His narrative braids learning and survival into an account that presents us with powerful ethical questions about the relationship of what Weiss Halivni has called the book and the sword, the title of his memoir. Title and narrative both point to a subtext that generates a question: do book or sword define the dominant meanings and values of human life? And in the face of murderous stereotyping, what kind of resistance is possible? For Weiss Halivni, these issues turn on a fragment, a blättel, a page of Jewish learning. The Nazi guard in the forced labor camp had wrapped his nighttime snack in the blättel, and how Weiss Halivni discovers it and how it matters for him and his fellow inmates is the thread I follow here. Halivni's testimony takes place 6 years after Kristallnacht. For with the Nazi invasion of Hungary in the spring of 1944, the 15-year-old David Weiss Halivni, already a young boy who was acknowledged as an Ilui, a brilliant interpreter of classic Jewish texts, and lived in Siget, his hometown that was also home to Elie Wiesel, was rounded up by the Nazis along with his family and neighbors. He was pushed into the ghetto and later transported to Auschwitz. The Nazis were intent on killing all the Jews, but the war had dragged on and they needed workers. So Weiss Halivni describes his forced labor situation in his riveting autobiography, as he also recounts how he tried, despite the Nazi effort, to dehumanize him to continue his Jewish life. In the camp, he ended up at Grossberg. Halivni held study sessions focused on a passage of the Mishnah, the Tractate Shabbat, which is familiar to many of his fellow inmates since it's included in the traditional prayer book. When he did not recall a word or two of the tractate, he notes, others would help recall the missing word or phrase. But they had no books, so the text was being studied now as part of an oral tradition. I have to stop and say, when I teach poetry, I require my students to memorize